It's their first taste of freedom. Researchers are releasing several Przewalski horses into the wild.
It's the only truly wild horse on Earth.
In the winter of 1985, a cargo plane touched down on a runway in northwestern China, carrying 11 animals that had never once felt wind that wasn't filtered through a fence. They stepped onto the tarmac and then, soon after, onto a stretch of land that local herders had quietly given up on decades earlier. It wasn't called a desert on the old maps. It was called grassland. But by the time these 11 horses arrived, there was nothing green left to justify the name. Scientists who studied the region called it one of the most degraded landscapes in Asia. Local officials called it something closer to an embarrassment, a place their own economic plans had helped destroy. And almost everyone who looked closely at the animals being unloaded that day agreed on one thing: they were not going to survive. This is the story of how that prediction turned out to be spectacularly wrong, and how a herd of horses that modern science had almost lost forever ended up doing something no bulldozer, no irrigation canal, and no government reforestation campaign had managed to do in a generation: turn a dying desert back into living land. To understand why anyone thought releasing horses into a desert made sense, you have to understand what kind of horse we're actually talking about. The animals in that cargo hold were Przewalski's horses, named after the Russian explorer who first documented them for Western science in the 1870s, though local Mongolian and Central Asian peoples had known them for millennia as the Taki, spirit, or holy horse. Every horse you've ever ridden, fed a carrot to, or watched in a Kentucky Derby broadcast descends from animals that humans tamed and reshaped over roughly 5,500 years of selective breeding. Przewalski's horses do not. Count their chromosomes and you'll find 66, not the 64 carried by every domestic horse on the planet. They are, genetically and behaviorally, a separate branch of the horse family tree, the last wild horse subspecies never brought under the saddle, never bred for a task, never selected for temperament around people. They look the part. Compact and muscular, standing barely over 4 feet at the shoulder, with sandy dun coats, dark dorsal stripes running the length of their spines, and stiff upright manes that never fall to one side the way a domestic horse's does. Faint striping sometimes shows on the legs, a quiet echo of a much older equine lineage. If you've ever seen the horses painted on the walls of Lascaux or Chauvet Cave, you've essentially seen a Przewalski's horse. They are, in a very real sense, a living Ice Age relic that happened to survive into the era of satellites and cargo planes. That survival was not guaranteed. By the middle of the 20th century, hunting, habitat loss, and competition with domestic livestock had pushed wild populations to the brink. The last verified sighting of a truly wild Przewalski's horse in its historic range came in the late 1960s. After that, the species existed nowhere on Earth except inside zoo enclosures, a genetic inheritance preserved by fewer than 24 founding animals, most of them captured decades earlier and shipped to European collections. At one especially precarious point, the entire global population could be traced back to a double-digit number of individuals, a bottleneck so severe that conservation geneticists still study it as a textbook case of a species pulled back from the edge of extinction by the narrowest possible margin. By the 1980s, breeding programs across Europe and the United States had grown that population back into the hundreds. The horses existed. What didn't exist anymore was a home for them. The place chosen for their return was the Yungar Basin, a vast depression in China's Xinjiang region, bordered by the Altai Mountains to the north and the Tian Shan Range to the south. For thousands of years before human intervention scrambled the ecology, this basin had been exactly the kind of open, arid steppe that wild horses evolved to inhabit: sparse grass, seasonal water, brutal temperature swings, and just enough rainfall to keep a fragile grassland alive, provided something kept churning the soil and cycling the nutrients. That something had been herds of wild grazing animals, horses included, for tens of thousands of years. When those animals disappeared from the region, pushed out by hunting, herding pressure, and the steady expansion of human settlement, the ecological machinery they had quietly operated for millennia simply stopped. What followed over the next 2 decades reads like a slow-motion catastrophe. Without hooves breaking up the surface, the topsoil compacted into a hardened crust. Chinese soil scientists studying the basin in the 1970s described a landscape where rain no longer soaked into the ground. It beaded and ran off the hardened surface almost the way it would off pavement, evaporating within hours instead of recharging groundwater. Without moisture penetration, seeds that might otherwise have germinated simply sat dormant or died. Vegetation cover collapsed. And once vegetation goes, wind erosion takes over, stripping away whatever loose topsoil remains and exposing bare, lifeless subsoil beneath. The consequences reached far beyond Xinjiang itself. Northwestern China in the 1970s and 1980s was becoming ground zero for a national desertification crisis, one severe enough that it registered as far away as Beijing. Spring dust storms, carrying sand and topsoil scoured from degraded basins like this one, were becoming a near-annual event in the capital, blanketing the city, grounding flights, and sending respiratory patients into hospitals in numbers that alarmed public health officials. China's government had already launched an enormous reforestation initiative, an ambitious tree planting program stretching across the country's arid north, intended to build a literal green wall against the advancing sand. It was one of the largest afforestation efforts ever attempted by any nation, and by many measures it struggled in exactly the places it was needed most, because the fast-growing trees chosen for speed and cost often demanded more groundwater than these fragile arid regions could spare, in some cases drawing down water tables that took generations to recover. It was against this backdrop, a national desertification emergency, a reforestation strategy running into diminishing returns, and a captive-bred wild horse population with nowhere left to call home, that a small group of Chinese ecologists proposed something that struck most of their peers as close to absurd. Instead of fighting the desert with more infrastructure, why not reintroduce the animal that had shaped this landscape for tens of thousands of years before humans ever interfered with it? The case for reintroduction rested on an idea that was, at the time, still fairly new to mainstream restoration ecology, that certain large herbivores aren't just passive residents of an ecosystem, they're active architects of it. Ecologists sometimes call these species ecosystem engineers, organisms whose ordinary daily behavior physically reshapes the environment around them in ways that ripple outward to benefit dozens of other species. For a horse, that engineering happens in three overlapping ways. The first is mechanical. A horse weighing several hundred pounds concentrates enormous pressure into a small hoof, and when a herd moves across compacted, crusted soil, that repeated impact does something a plow or a tiller can't easily replicate. It fractures the hardened surface without stripping away the fragile organic layer beneath, creating thousands of small depressions per hectare that act as tiny catchments. Rain that would once have run off the hardpan in minutes now has somewhere to pool and slowly soak in. The second is dietary and behavioral. Unlike a machine or a static conservation fence, grazing horses are selective. They don't strip a landscape uniformly. They graze intensively in patches, move on, return later, and in doing so create what ecologists call a disturbance mosaic, a shifting patchwork of short grass, tall grass, and bare ground that supports a much wider range of insect, bird, and small mammal species than a uniform landscape ever could. Grazing pressure, counterintuitively, often stimulates grass to grow back thicker and more vigorously than if it were left completely untouched, a phenomenon long documented in grassland ecology as compensatory growth. The third is almost accidental, and it's arguably the most powerful: manure. Horse dung isn't simply waste. It's a seed dispersal mechanism, a fertilizer, and a rehydration system rolled into one. Seeds that pass through a horse's digestive tract often survive intact, and the process of digestion can actually help break down tough seed coats that would otherwise keep the seed dormant for years, improving germination odds once the dung is deposited, often miles from where the plant it came from was originally grazed. Multiply that by a herd moving many kilometers a day, and you get a slow, steady seeding of the landscape, carried out for free, indefinitely, by an animal that asks nothing from anyone in return. The scientists behind the reintroduction argued that if this engineering could be switched back on, the desert wasn't necessarily dead. It was dormant, waiting for the one species that had shaped it in the first place to come home. Their skeptics, and there were many, pointed to an obvious flaw in the plan. The horses being proposed for release had never lived a day of wild life. They'd been born in zoo enclosures in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the United States, fed from buckets, sheltered from weather, and given no reason to ever develop the survival instincts a wild population needs. 3 to 4 generations separated these animals from anything resembling a genuinely wild ancestor. Whatever knowledge their species had once carried about finding water in a frozen desert, reading a predator's approach, or surviving temperatures 40 degrees below freezing, had, as far as anyone could prove, simply been bred out of them by decades of human care. The Chinese program didn't gamble everything on a single dramatic release. It unfolded in careful stages, spread across more than a decade, and much of that time was spent doing something closer to rehabilitation than reintroduction. Horses imported from European and American zoos were first settled into a breeding and acclimatization center near Jimsar, in Xinjiang, where they could be monitored closely while slowly adjusting to a climate and diet far removed from anything they'd known. Even this transitional phase tested the animals harshly. Parasites that had never troubled them in climate-controlled enclosures suddenly became a serious problem in an open-air environment. Extreme temperature swings, brutal winters followed by scorching summers, took a physical toll that concerned the veterinary staff monitoring the herd. There were losses. There were setbacks that, at several points, gave the program's critics fresh ammunition to argue the whole effort was a slow-motion failure dressed up as conservation. But something else was happening alongside the hardship, something the research team hadn't fully anticipated. Behaviors that no one on staff had ever taught these animals began to surface. Horses that had spent their entire lives drinking from mechanically refilled troughs started breaking through surface ice with their hooves to reach water underneath. Mares began forming loose protective circles around foals during storms, rotating position so that no single animal bore the brunt of the wind for too long. Horses started digging through snow cover with a sweeping foreleg motion to expose buried grass, a foraging technique that has never been documented in a captive-born horse that hadn't already been exposed to snow-covered range. None of this had been modeled. None of it had been trained. It simply emerged, as if the behavioral memory of the species had been sitting dormant through generations of zoo life, waiting for a landscape harsh enough to call it back out. Researchers studying the phenomenon began to describe it less as instinct in the narrow genetic sense and more as a kind of latent cultural knowledge, behavior that a species carries the capacity for, even after generations without the environmental pressure that would normally teach it directly. As the acclimatized herd grew and stabilized through the late 1980s and 1990s, researchers began documenting changes in the surrounding land that went well beyond anything the animals were doing directly for themselves. In grazed plots monitored against untouched control areas, vegetation density and regrowth rates climbed noticeably. Soil moisture retention improved measurably in areas where the horses had been active, a direct consequence of all those small hoof-punch depressions collecting rainfall instead of shedding it. Nitrogen levels in heavily used soil rose as manure reintroduced nutrients and microbial life that had effectively vanished from the basin when its original grazing animals disappeared decades earlier. Plants that field botanists hadn't recorded in the region in years began reappearing, not because anyone had reseeded the area, but because dormant seed banks buried in the degraded soil were finally getting the moisture and disturbance they needed to germinate. Once plant cover returned even modestly, the rest of the food web began reassembling itself in a predictable cascade. Insects that depend on specific plant species came back first. Birds that feed on those insects followed. Small mammals moved into the cover that returning vegetation provided. And eventually, camera traps in the reserve began picking up predators, foxes, birds of prey, and occasionally wolves, species that had effectively abandoned the basin when it stopped supporting anything worth hunting. None of this happened overnight, and none of it happened in a straight line. There were harsh winters that killed foals, droughts that stalled vegetation recovery, and years where researchers weren't entirely sure the trend they thought they were seeing was real rather than noise. But over roughly a decade and a half of sustained monitoring, the pattern held. Land that had been functionally dead in the 1970s was, by the early 2000s, supporting a measurably more diverse and more resilient ecosystem than it had in a generation. By 2001, the program's leadership judged the herd ready for the boldest phase of the plan, a genuine release into the much larger Kalameli Nature Reserve, without fencing, without supplemental feeding, and without the safety net of daily human monitoring that had defined the acclimatization years. 24 or so horses were selected for this fully wild release, fitted with GPS tracking collars so researchers could follow their movements remotely rather than through direct observation. For the first several days, the herd behaved almost exactly as skeptics had predicted zoo-raised animals would. They stayed close to the release site, moved in tight, uncertain loops, and showed little sign of the exploratory range-finding behavior wild herds typically display. Then, within roughly a week, the movement patterns changed. One stallion, leading a small harem of mares and young, set off in a direct, purposeful line away from the release point, covering tens of kilometers over the following day in a route that showed none of the aimless wandering researchers had seen up to that point. Where he stopped was the striking part. The herd arrived at a natural spring that did not appear on any of the reserve's hydrological survey maps used by the research team. No human had guided him there. No prior generation of that specific bloodline had lived in that landscape to pass along the knowledge by example. Whatever combination of scent, terrain reading, memory, or instinct led him to that water source remains, to this day, something researchers can describe but not fully explain. That single episode became something of a symbolic turning point for the program, a concrete demonstration that whatever had been lost to captivity clearly hadn't been lost as completely as the early skeptics assumed. Over the following years, the released population established territories, developed stable breeding harems, and posted foaling and survival rates that in several years outperformed comparable captive breeding populations, a result that surprised even researchers who had been cautiously optimistic about the release. What began with 11 animals in the mid-1980s had, by the early 2020s, grown into a population numbering in the several hundreds within the Xinjiang program alone, spread across an area of managed and semi-wild range covering tens of thousands of hectares. Ecological economists who later attempted to quantify the value of that recovery, factoring in soil restoration, water retention, carbon sequestration, seed dispersal, and biodiversity support, arrived at estimates suggesting that grazing populations like this one were generating ecological services worth tens of millions of dollars annually across the reserve, a figure that dwarfed the relatively modest cost of the original reintroduction program. Perhaps more significantly, satellite monitoring of the basin showed something that decades of tree planting elsewhere in China's arid north had struggled to achieve at comparable cost. Vegetation cover expanding outward from the core horse territories, and in localized zones, measurable slowing or reversal of the desertification trend that had defined the region for most of the 20th century. Groundwater levels that had been declining for decades in parts of the basin showed signs of stabilizing as the restored grassland reduced runoff and improved infiltration. The success didn't stay contained to Xinjiang. Mongolia had already begun its own Przewalski's horse reintroduction into Hustai National Park in the early 1990s, and by the 2020s the population had grown into the hundreds as well, with researchers documenting similar patterns of grassland recovery around it. Kazakhstan launched a comparable initiative in the mid-2020s, relocating horses from European zoo populations into the country's central steppe. Conservationists in Russia have studied both programs closely as they weigh similar reintroductions within their own historic Przewalski's horse range. China's own plans for the Kalamali Reserve now extend well beyond the original scope of the 1980s project, with stated ambitions to grow the wild population several times over in the coming decades and expand the protected range accordingly. If the current trajectory holds, researchers involved in long-term monitoring believe the basin could become one of the first substantially degraded desert landscapes in modern history to be meaningfully restored.